Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 28. This is the Dark Mode edition. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. So Mr. Scott McBrien is taking some much-needed time off, so I figured I'd come and hang out with y'all for Dark Mode tonight. Excuse me. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics as a former systems administrator, and that is system roles. In a very brief nutshell, what a system role is an Ansible playbook that is built against a predefined module of configurations. So imagine setting up your firewall for 1,000 systems by hand. Can you imagine how painful and tedious that might be? Or take a system role and about half a dozen lines of code, YAML code for that matter, and being able to deploy that same configuration across your entire fleet of Red Hat Enterprise Linux systems. It's not limited to firewalls either. There is an entire family of system roles, and we're developing more with every release. So we've got firewall, we've got networking, we've got web console, we've got kernel settings, we've got session recording. So there is a huge number of system roles available, and that number is constantly growing. So imagine being able to take some best practice guidance on how a particular system service should be configured, put that into an Ansible playbook, run a command, and have it basically disseminated across your entire fleet. So, with that said, let's dive in. So, if I'm going to use system roles, I need first Ansible installed, as well as the RHEL system roles packages. That's what gives us all the documentation on our system. That's what gives us all the modules we can build off of. And to gain access to that, notice tonight we are running a RHEL 9 system. So to do that, what I need to do is to first get my clipboard to actually cooperate. So what we're going to do is we're going to enable the Ansible automation platform for RHEL 9 repository through Red Hat CDN. So we're going to use the subscription manager repos command and the official name of the repository. So we're going to kick that off, and what it's doing in the background is it's checking to verify that we actually have registered the system. It's communicating with Red Hat CDN. It's ensuring that we have a properly named repository. Excuse me. And then it pulls down all the metadata, so we have a full list of all the packages that are available in that system. From there, we're going to do a DNF install, and we're going to do a TAC-Y just so it doesn't ask me if I'm sure, because I'm pretty sure I'm sure. So we're going to install the RHEL package, or we're going to install the Ansible package. That's why you don't type and talk at the same time. We're going to install the Ansible package and the RHEL system roles package. So it's going to go out and pull down repo information for our new Ansible automation platform repository. It's going to grab Ansible core, RHEL system roles, and some of the Python and SSH dependencies that are part of this. So now that we've got the packages installed that we need to execute an Ansible playbook, I've taken the liberty of going ahead and creating a YAML file to serve as our playbook. So soe.yaml, that's not a Red Hat thing. SOE stands for Standard Operating Environment, and it's a concept within the IT industry that basically says that if I take this playbook and run it against any new system that comes online, I can be somewhat confident that all of my systems will be configured the exact same way. So don't get hung up on the file name, but instead just know that soe.yaml is just short for Standard Operating Environment. So if you're looking at infrastructure as code, using golden images with some sort of automation to build out your infrastructure, SOE is a concept that you might want to look into for inspiration. So remember how I said that you could do a kernel module or you could do a RHEL system role with basically 6 lines of configuration code? Well, here you go. I've gone ahead and populated out 2 different system roles. So if you look down here at the bottom at the roles category of in our YAML file here, you notice that RHEL system roles is sort of a directory heading. And then within that, we've got kernel settings and tlog. Tlog, if you remember from a previous episode, is the session recording that can tie into any of your systems. We'll get to that one a little bit later in the episode. But jumping back to the top here, hosts, we're only going to run this against our local host at the moment. And then the vars that we want to look at, I've listed out a few common kernel module kernel parameters that typically get changed. But I want to draw your attention particularly to the vm.swappiness. So swappiness basically decides how often the system pulls something out of memory and puts it into swap. So it's not as prevalently used, but back in the day of RAM being incredibly expensive and, 8 or 24 gig of RAM was a lot. Swappiness was a little bit more critical, but it still exists in the system because you may not want all of your data sitting in your virtual memory. You may want to dump it off to disk, or for other reasons. So because Into the Terminal is a bit of a cooking show, what I want to do is I want to, before we run anything, is we are going to actually see what the swappiness setting is on our local machine. So you do that by, you can either cat or vi the proc sys vm swappiness file. And what that does is tells us we currently have a swappiness setting of 60. So calling back to our configuration file, we actually changed it to be 20. So now that we've got access to the system, now that we've got our YAML file with our system roles defined, let's go ahead and run the Ansible playbook command, and we're going to define our soe.yaml file. So what it's going to do, if you haven't worked with Ansible previously, it works very similarly to other systems like Puppet or Salt or Chef. So it starts out by gathering facts. That's basic system data. That's what kernel version you're using. That's certain packages that are installed. That's the operating system version. And then what it's going to go in and do is start changing. Making changes using our system roles. So you notice that there's a few tasks that were skipped. There were a number of tasks, usually pre-checks, that were okay, and then we changed 13 items. So some of that is the swappiness, some of that is configuring tlog. In fact, we'll see a little bit later in the episode that we can actually tell our local host to install necessary packages, and so that was part of the process that happened. But for the sake of our high-level overview, let's look at our swappiness file again. And voila, we now have a swappiness setting of 20 instead of 60. Okay, so if you have any questions tonight, excuse me, feel free to put them in the chat. I will do my best to monitor those. These are always fun to do flying solo. And the weather's decided to be uncooperative, so I can barely breathe, so bear with me. So our initial example covered only local host. So what we want to do is to be able to manage multiple systems, because while system roles on a single host would be nice, there is so much more we could do if we're doing this at scale. So let's go ahead and define a host configuration file. So for the sake of today's example, let's do host.ini. Now, you can either list out individual systems, or you can actually create groups of systems, and these groups can be just about anything that your heart will desire, and we'll get into some examples here in just a minute. But you notice, because we are very creative when we come to naming in our labs, we've got not only the local system that we did the initial example on, but we also have Client 1 and Client 2. Those are two other RHEL 9 systems that I have available to me in this lab. So what I want to do is I want to enter insert mode, and we're going to create a group called clients. And in that group, we're going to put in Client 1. And these can be short names. These could be short names that point to a fully qualified domain name in the Etsy host file. a lot of times you probably want a fully qualified domain name. So if you have a host name and then an FQDN, you could put that in here as well. One of the other things we might do is one of the other things we could do is the question of handling both local data center operations as well as Azure and AWS. So what I recommended was, if you had, like I have a home lab here, and that might have my Minecraft server and maybe a Plex server, and then I've got, so I use DigitalOcean to run additional workloads, and I've got a Matrix server there. And then AWS was mentioned, so we could have AWS where we've got web.aws.org. Sorry, AWS, but that's just what I came up with out of my head. And then maybe we've got another app that runs on Azure, but this is more of a 3-tier app. So we've got a web app, and then we could have Azure database. So maybe this application has a database to it as well. So you notice we can very quickly and very easily list out all the systems that we have available. And in fact, if we do an episode on Ansible specifically, we can also talk about how to dynamically populate a host file. But what I wanted to drive home was with this, you can actually create, you can actually put in groups. You can actually put in individual hosts on multiple systems. So if we look and see that I've got a Minecraft server, a Plex server, a Web 1 server, so I can actually have these in multiple groups. And what's amazing is when you take the time to define this out and list your servers, list your clients, I should say, in their designated files. What you can do is you can very quickly generate roles that call on system roles that do specific configuration or install certain services just based on what group they're in. So for instance, if you have, so let's go ahead and put it in here. So your servers may get a standard set of packages, maybe an antivirus, maybe something like CrowdSec that checks to make sure that you're not getting a denial of service attack or traffic from a blacklisted IP address. But so you would want all of your servers to get those packages and all those roles, but you wouldn't necessarily want all of your servers to get, say, Microsoft SQL Server or PostgreSQL or something. So that's why you would want to break them out based on workload. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. Let's see. Just so I don't break anything while we're doing a lab. So there's a lot of different ways you can lay out this file, and it really lends itself well to a lot of different configuration options, a lot of roles that you can write and build on existing content. Okay, so that was a lot more in depth on the host file than I thought I would go into, but it's going to come into play with our soe.yaml file. So you notice I mentioned at the top of the show that we have a local host file, and that we only have localhost defined as a targeted host. So what we want to do is we created a group called clients for our two remote systems, client 1 and client 2. So we want to add localhost, but we also want this to impact our clients group so that those two servers get this configuration as well. So to prove that I don't have any cards up my sleeve or anything, we're going to run a quick loop to check the swappiness on our remote systems. So don't let this intimidate you. I'll walk you through what this command does. So the key is here down at the end. We want to SSH to a variable which will be pointed to a host name, and we're going to cat that swappiness file. So the loop is for I in client 1 and client 2 do this command. So what we want to do is we want to take that variable I, client 1 or client 2, and that'll echo into our SSH command here. So what it's going to do is it's going to give us a client name and the output of the swappiness file from client 1 and client 2. You see they're both at 60, but like we did at the top of the show, our swappiness is set to 20. So if I go back in and do an Ansible playbook on our soe.yaml file, you'll notice that the output is, hold on. It helps when you're doing something like this to make sure that I did save the file. Interesting. Sure, I still had it in my clipboard. So there's the command that I was using to pull in let's see, could not ignoring clients. Did I fat finger something? This is the fun of doing this live on air, because I feel like, let's grab we'll do a copy pasta here. Let's see. Okay, so hosts, local hosts, and clients. That looks good. So let me run that again. Oh, I know what it was. Trust me, folks, I am a professional. So the part that I left out was that you actually have to give an additional argument if you're specifying a host file. So you want Ansible playbook soe.yaml that defines the actual contents of the playbook. Then you want to do attack I for inventory and point to the host file. So one of the other ways you can break up groupings within Ansible is to actually have multiple host files. So you may have one host file that's broken down by workload, like I showed you a moment ago, and then have a second file for your dev instances and a third file for your QE environment. So you can actually break up hosts very, very differently based on your needs. So don't forget that tag I, host.ini. And now you will notice that it actually is pulling in the clients group as well. So we're going to see a lot of the same output, but this time it's going to be running these commands simultaneously on all three nodes, localhost, client 1, and client 2. So you might notice as this scrolls by that there's some areas where localhost was already marked as green and client 1 and client 2 were marked in yellow because we haven't addressed their configuration yet. So like right there, it's configuring SSSD logging for our session recording. In fact, let's go ahead and test that. If we were to do an SSH on localhost and verify that we do want that fingerprint to be saved, you notice right here that we do in fact have session recording working, because we get this message when we log in that says, "Hey, you're being recorded, so don't do anything too crazy." Yeah, I agree. Minor details, just helps if you actually define the host file that you're working with. Definitely, if you have any questions, be sure to put them in chat. Otherwise, it's just a monologue of me talking into the ether. So feel free to share any questions you might have. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and so I did these ahead of time, and in fact, they are a part of a lab on lab.redhat.com called RHEL System Roles. Let me grab the URL for that as well, because you can actually go through and follow what I'm doing. A lot of our objectives with this show is to have the commands available, or in this case, to actually have an interactive lab where you can go through and follow the video after the fact with those instructions on the right-hand side. So if you haven't checked out lab.redhat.com, definitely do that. With that free PSA out of the way, let's go ahead and let's add a role live on air, because, what could possibly go wrong? Not that fortunately so far my only issue has been self-inflicted. So we are actually going to use the timesync role, because who doesn't love timesync? So you'll remember recently that You'll you may recall that with RHEL 9, there's been some changes to the timekeeping piece of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. In fact, we're using cronid now for that. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and specify some new hosts to pull in our a synchronized time. So what I went ahead and instead of forcing you all to watch me type this as we go, so we've got timesync NTP servers. That's the var name that ties into this timesync system role. We specified two new hosts to pull time from, and we're going to enable iBurst. So let's go ahead and write and save this file. Make sure to add the roles, make sure to add the vars, and we're not making any changes to our hosts, so we'll keep that the same. Go ahead and write quit or :X if you're like me and every keystroke counts. So what I want to do here is I want to grab another SSH command, because usually we think of SSH as just getting a remote terminal, but we can actually run commands remotely. Excuse me. So if we do an SSH to client 1 and we call the cronny C system service and we pull sources, it'll give us a nice output of the name and IP address, the stratum poll, and some performance information. So you notice that we were talking about time-D. So the NIST.gov NTP servers are fairly standard, and then there's a RHEL pool as well. So what we're going to go ahead and do is this time we're actually going to remember to specify TAC I, because I did that for y'all's benefit, So we're going to go ahead and run that playbook, and as that's running, there are a couple of questions in chat, so thank you for that. The first one, are the system roles part of the same repository as Ansible? And yes, they are. In fact, one of the first steps that was required was to enable the Ansible automation platform for RHEL 9 system repository. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but we used a command early on to enable. Let me grab the RPM name and put that into chat as well. Or the so we enabled the Ansible automation platform for RHEL 9 repository, and that is where the RHEL system roles package lives, as well as the Ansible core RPM itself. And then for the other question here, let's go ahead and let's pull up this one. So system roles get installed. I do believe they're in user share. I think they're under system role collections. There they are. Okay, so after all that, so this is the directory where the system roles live, and you can actually go in there, and there's some licensing materials, there's some README files, some doc files. So if you go in and look under user share Ansible and kind of dig down through collections, you'll eventually get down to RHEL system roles. And if we look at the specific roles, you can see all the ones that are available. So we've got Web Console under Cockpit, we've got SSH, we've got TimeSync, which we just ran, we've got Tlog, which we set up earlier. So you can go in and kind of see what all is included. So you're basically just sending a list of variables to these predefined roles. So we can, if you're familiar with Ansible, these directories will feel fairly familiar. So we can dig all the way down into, say, the main tasks for the Tlog system role, and we'll see all the different facts that it plugs in to make sure it gets the right packages. And so you can actually go in here and see everything that it does. In fact, I think I scrolled past it already, but you can actually see where it calls to install the Cockpit Tlog package. Oh, right there it is. So it'll actually make sure that that package is installed and make sure that the service is running. So if you want to dig in deep, if you're familiar with Ansible, you can go in and see exactly what the system roles are doing, and that might give you a better view of what is in why we're filling out these options as part of vars. While we're on that point, though, I do want to say that a lot of tonight's content was not my doing. In fact, one of our PMs, who's also my co-host on Red Hat Enterprise Linux Presents, Mr. Brian Smith, has a System Roles blog series. So for every blog that we release to GA, he writes a blog on what it's for, how to use it, some of the options, and then gives you a step-by-step example on how to deploy a particular system role. Okay. So when last we spoke, we were scroll up through my history here. We'd actually added a time sync system role to our playbook. So if we go ahead and look at client 1 a second time, now that we've run the playbook and we didn't have any errors, now you notice that we've got the NIST.gov host, and we've got a host from the pool of RHEL NTP servers. So that was a success. So the last example that I want to run through, excuse me, the last example I want to run through is, so far these examples have shown you how to, there is a, the last example I want to go through will add a little bit more to your toolbox. So far, what we've done is we've taken something and we've installed it from scratch, or we've configured it from scratch, away from the system defaults. So what happens when you've deployed Ansible playbooks using system roles to your 1,000 systems, and now all of a sudden you realize that, to use our earlier example, that, you know what, a swappiness of 20 just isn't cutting it. We want to do a swappiness of 10. So now, do I go out there and go into the kernel configuration on all 1,000 servers? Not at all. But so instead, what we do is we just come into our playbook, we change swappiness to, in our playbook to, can't talk and type, apparently. So we just change that variable for from 20 down to 10, and then we can rerun our... Let's do this. Then we would just rerun our playbook. And in case you didn't catch what I did there, if you hit Control-R on the keyboard in Bash, you can actually do a reverse search. So it'll look from most recent to oldest through your Bash history and find commands that you've run. I use this a lot of times on commands that I find myself running over and over again. Like if I'm iterating on an Ansible playbook, I just use Control-R, find the previous command, and hit Enter, and it'll run as if I typed all that. So while that's running, we'll notice that there'll be a lot of green, a lot of blue, and just a couple of yellow. But while that's running, I'll go ahead and grab another question here. So I don't think... so the question is there a system role for AD client and SAP cluster members? I don't think so for either of those. Ansible Galaxy is a good place to look, as Doomed pointed out. However, I know there is a Microsoft SQL system role that allows you to install and configure Microsoft SQL. Microsoft SQL Server for Linux, I should be specific. So I do believe one for SAP is in the works, if not on the roadmap at some point. So keep an eye out for that. AD client configuration would be a good one. I'll definitely pass that along to engineering. So as I said, nothing failed. We had 30 tasks that were skipped. We had 33 that were okay, and we only had a couple that actually changed. And so if we go back to, if we check on the swappiness of client 1, we can see that it is down to a setting of 10. And so that works at a much larger scale. You can actually have multiple playbooks that reference multiple inventory files that have different system roles in them. So, I mean, this becomes a very, very quick way to get a system from vanilla to basically your corporate standard. So if you tie in system roles with something like image builder. You can have image builder managing your golden templates. You can have system roles defining all of your basic systems. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, every one of our every release we release one or a few new system roles. So we released a couple of new ones with 9.0. There'll be more this fall with 9.1. So system roles are not going away. In fact, we're constantly evaluating our list of priorities and looking at what different applications what kinds of applications or system services do we feel would be beneficial to have as a system role to more easily manage our infrastructure. So with that being said, that brings us to the bottom of the hour. Definitely thank you all for the questions in the chat. Thank you for bearing with me as my voice isn't what it usually is, and as I'm flying solo tonight. So thank you all very much for joining us. So Doomed asked if there were any system roles for firewalls, and there is in fact, and it works amazing. It's really nice not to have to go to all of my systems and open up port 9090 for web console. So definitely there is a system role for firewalls. I think it is in the blog series. If not, it will be soon. With that being said, that brings us to the end of this week's Into the Terminal. Join us next Wednesday, where Gunnar Hellickson, the VP of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, will be joining Brian Smith and myself for an exciting episode of Red Hat Enterprise Linux Presents. And then Scott will be back with me on Thursday for Into the Terminal, both light and dark modes. We'll be talking about how to customize your shell. The shell can do a lot more than just you can create aliases, you can create shortcuts. There's so much more that you can get out of your shell than just running commands on a vanilla bash instance. So we're going to pick out some of our favorite features and bring them live to you next Thursday for our regular episode and for dark mode as well. But until then, thank you so much on behalf of Red Hat Enterprise, on behalf of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux team. I am Eric, the IT guy, and thank you for joining us.